Hi, everyone. So as Talesh mentioned, the title of my talk is Imagining a World Without Caching. And just quick to introduce myself. So I'm a Magento developer, and I work at Something Digital. We're a Magento Enterprise Solution Partner. I'm based here in New York City, actually. I'm a pretty active blogger. I try to post something at least once a week. I write a lot about Magento, but not exclusively about Magento. I just write in general about tech-related things. The topic of this talk is caching, and it's an area that I've focused a lot of my research on. So I've spoken in the past at Nomad Mage, at the New York City Magento meetup, specifically on this topic of caching. So to start out, maybe some of you have seen this quote or know this quote, but it's a pretty famous one, and I'll read it to you. It says, there are only two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation and naming things. And the next thing that I wanted to pull up, this is a screenshot from the Magento forums. This was something that was posted for the Dev Exchange at Magento Imagine this past year, and the title of the topic was Performance is Not About Caching. And it got a lot of upvotes, and you can maybe see that the status is accepted, so it was something that was talked about at the Dev Exchange at Imagine. And that was just in 2017 when that went up, but this is an article going from 5 years back. You can see it's dated in 2012, and it's basically expressing the same sentiment that caching is not performance optimization, and this is also coming from a Magento community member. So if cache invalidation is one of the hardest things to do, and having a performant Magento site is not about doing caching in the first place, why do we bother with caching? That's what this talk is going to investigate. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a few different types of caching, sorry about that, that are involved when a user makes an HTTP request to Magento. And we're going to kind of follow it across the network. So we're going to start out with browser caching. Sorry, I don't have a virus. I just sometimes I have to look at malware. And I have malware downloaded on my site on my computer, and I still haven't figured out how to make Sofo shut up about it. But so like I said, we're going to be kind of following the journey across the network. So we're going to start out in the browser and take a look at browser caching. And then following that, we're going to take a look as the request actually hits the network. And we're going to take a look at edge caching. And then we're going to finally take a look at when the request ultimately reaches the end server and take a look at full page caching. And I just wanted to note that these are not the only types of caching that are involved when a user requests a page from Magento. Caching is happening on all levels of the stack. It's happening in the Linux kernel. It's happening at the CPU level. So there's caching pretty much everywhere you look. So let's imagine what the world would look like without any caching. So as I mentioned, the first type of caching that we're going to talk about is browser caching. So quickly, I just wanted to start out with a definition of it. So what is browser caching? So when a user requests a web page or asset, the browser will first check its cache to see if the response is available in that cache. And these cache contents are actually stored in the browser on the device that's making the request. And if the response for that request is in that cache, then the request will never go out and hit the network. And the way that this works is that the application uses HTTP response headers, and those instruct the browser how to cache the responses that it sends back. So here's a more of a practical example of how it works. This comes from the htaccess file that you get out of box with Magento 2. This is where you define how you're going to tell the browser to cache the responses. And this is how Magento does it. So you can see there's 3 directives there. The first expires default access plus 1 year. So by default, Magento will tell the browser to cache anything it sends it for 1 year. Underneath that, it makes 2 important exceptions. So it says expires by type text/plain and expires by type text/HTML. A0. So what that means is in those cases, when Magento sends back those type of resources, an HTML document or a plain text response, it tells the browser, hey, I don't want you to cache this at all. So now that we know what browser caching is and how it works from a Magento standpoint, let's take a look at what the world would look like if there was no browser caching. So to do this, I've used a tool called Webpage Test. Maybe some of you know it. It's a very useful tool. It allows you to run what they call a performance test on a URL. And you can configure some different parameters about the test. So for example, you can choose a different test location. They have test locations all across the world. You can simulate different type of network conditions. If you wanted to slow down and simulate a 3G connection, that's something you can do with it. The important thing that I've done here for this test is that I've configured Webpage Test to make the exact same request 2 times. And the reason that that's important is the first time, there's nothing in the browser cache. And then the second time, everything that Magento sent back that first time that got into the cache will be leveraged. So we're comparing basically the first view and the repeat view. And this is a test that I ran against Amazon.com, one of the biggest websites in the world. And if we look at the load time for the page in the first view compared to the second view, we can see that it came down from 7.9 seconds, nearly 8 seconds, all the way down to less than 2 seconds. And a lot of that is aided by, or the majority of that is aided by the fact that we're getting the browser caches help the second time. If you look at the number of requests, you can see the first time it had to send 69 requests to Amazon.com. And you can see there were only 5 requests when we got the browser cache. So it's interesting that we say that, or in the Magento community, people say that performance is not about using caching, but we can see Webpage Test, which is a pretty well-regarded tool across the entire web community. It's a very important factor for the performance that they're grading you on. In fact, you can see that there's 6 different things that you're graded on: time to first byte, keep alive enabled, transfer compression. And one of the things that it's grading you on, which you can see Amazon got a C on, is properly caching static content. Maybe my screen went to sleep there. Sorry about that. So some pro tips in regards to browser caching. So in Magento 2, you can invalidate the browser cache via static asset deployment. So the way that this works is when you run the command to deploy static assets, Magento will generate a new version number. And then the URLs in the HTML document that's generated will reference that new version number. So the browser won't be able to check it, or it won't be able to use its cache in that case. So if you need to invalidate the browser cache in Magento 2, deploy static assets, and you've invalidated the browser cache. That being said, it's not the most flexible solution. Basically, you run the command, and it invalidates everything. Every single CSS or JavaScript file that you have referenced on that page becomes invalidated. There could be use cases where maybe you've just changed one JavaScript file out of 10 or 20 different JavaScript files on the page, and you really don't want to invalidate the entire cache. Unfortunately, there's not a great way to do that currently in Magento 2. But that's better than what we have in Magento 1, because in Magento 1, in fact, there's no browser cache invalidation at all that you get out of the box. At Something Digital, we have a tool that we build and we use internally and install on our client sites to help us out with this. But if you're looking for a solution for this, if you do a little Google searching, I don't have one that I can specifically recommend because we use the Something Digital tool. But I know there are plenty of solutions that you can buy, and I think there's even some free stuff you can install to help you with cache invalidation for Magento 1. One other thing that I bring up about browser caching is in regards to how Magento handles merging of JavaScript and CSS files. So the way that this happens is actually really bad for browser cache hit rates. The reason for this is that the way that it works is basically, let's say that a user requests the home page, and there's 5 different JavaScript files on that page. What Magento will do is it will detect, okay, cool, there's these 5 files. Let me merge them together into a single file. Then let me hash that file, and I'm going to generate a URL, which is a reference to that merged file. Let's say that next the user goes to a category page and it adds one new JavaScript file to the page. At that point, Magento doesn't detect, oh, I already sent you these 5 files. Use those, and then I'll send you this other one that you're going to need. It goes through the same process. Says, OK, there's 6 files here. Let me merge them all together, generate a merged file. Let me then hash it and generate a new hash. And let me deliver you this new file, which is a completely new file, and you don't have it in your cache, obviously, at that point. So it's not great from a browser cache hit rate standpoint. So HTTP2 has made merging not as important. That being said, it's not completely irrelevant. There are still some benefits to merging files together when you're using HTTP2. Specifically, you get better compression ratios if you merge files together. So it's still a good idea to be looking into merging even when you're using HTTP2, but I wouldn't recommend using the Magento solution. You should take a look at your theme and your site, because all themes have different assets that are being used, and basically roll your own merging solution. I think actually Anton Krill from Magento published something on his GitHub too for helping with merging. I haven't gone too deep into it, but I did see that. I think he tweeted that out. And then the final thing is to be very careful with caching of HTML documents. So if you remember when we looked at the htaccess file for Magento 2, we saw that it had those exceptions for text HTML and text plain documents. That actually does not exist in Magento 1. So it's kind of a pretty bad problem. I would probably fix it if Magento 1 were on GitHub, but it's not. So by default, when you're using Magento 1 with the htaccess file, it will cache HTML documents. And once those get into the user's browser cache, basically there's no way for you to invalidate it, because the request never winds up coming to the server. So that's really something to watch out for. OK, so we covered browser caching. The next type of caching we're going to talk about is edge caching. So the request at this point has gone out of the browser, and it's traversing the network. So a quick definition of edge caching. So traditionally, when a user makes a request, it travels all the way across the network to the physical server that's hosting whatever the resource is that the user's looking for. So what edge caching is it's this concept of a CDN, a content delivery network. So basically, it sits in between that user and the origin server that has the resource. And this is called at the edge, as in it's at the edge of the network that's closer to the user. And it caches the responses so that when the user makes the request, it doesn't have to go all the way to the server. It just gets it from that edge location, which is much closer geographically, and it helps reduce the round trip time from the browser to get that resource and get it back to them. And so these CDNs, they have many locations that are all across the world. This is one of the benefits is if a user's in Australia and your server's in the United States, they'll have an edge location that's in Australia, and it doesn't literally have to travel across the entire world to get that response. So these are very frequently and very easily used with static assets. So for example, images and JavaScript files. You can really just put a CDN in front of them, and you automatically just get the caching. You can serve HTML from the edge as well. It's a little bit more tricky because HTML has personalized content, like for example the little shopping cart icon that says how many items are in your cart. With Magento 2, there are some plugins that you can use. I'll get into CDN providers in a bit that make it really easy for you to serve HTML from the edge. And if you can serve HTML from the edge, it's really highly recommended. You'll see a drastic decrease in the time to first byte, just removing the network overhead, getting the HTML document from the edge. Specifically when there's like a big geographic distance between the browser and the user. But even if your server's in New York and the user's in California, you'll see a lot of savings there as well. So I just wanted to quickly cover some popular CDN providers. So Cloudflare. Cloudflare, I personally use it on my own website, which is maxchadwick.xyz. The great thing about Cloudflare is it's free, literally free. The way that it works is you route your DNS through them, and then you automatically just get a CDN for free out of it, which is really nice. Another one that's pretty popular is CloudFront. This is the AWS provided CDN, and with the the widespread usage of AWS, CloudFront always comes up in the conversation, or very frequently comes up in a CDN conversation. Akamai is one that I see a lot of people using. I tend to think of Akamai as being a little bit more enterprisey, maybe, with the type of clients that I'm seeing using Akamai, but it's a very popular CDN provider. So Fastly, I mentioned that there are some plugins that you can install for Magento, and you get HTML edge caching very easily. Fastly is one of them. Fastly is, if you sign up for Magento Cloud, Fastly is the CDN that you get with it. So it's notable for that reason, and then, yeah, as I said, you get the HTML edge caching, which is really nice via their Magento plugin. And another one that I wanted to call out is section.io. So I actually met one of the guys there at a previous talk I was doing about caching. He was actually also talking about caching. When they've demoed it for me, well, first of all, it has a Magento plugin like Fastly that allows you to cache HTML at the edge really easily. But when it was demoed for me, some of the other cool stuff that I saw is some of the developer grade features. So they have logs of all the stuff that's running through their service, which is really nice. If you sign up for Cloudflare, I know that you can't see the logs of what's happening in Cloudflare. And they've also have some integration with your local development environment, which is cool for testing as well. So they're another cool provider. So again, we've talked about what edge caching is and looked at some of the options for using it. So let's imagine what the world would look like if we didn't have any edge caching. So what I've done here, I actually used Webpage Test again to do this measurement. And I simulated the test to run the test location in Australia. And it was hitting my website, maxchadwick.xyz, which is hosted at GitHub Pages, which when I geolocated the IP address, it says San Francisco, but I'm not sure if that's really where their servers are, but it's somewhere in the US. And the way that I did the test was basically I took the static HTML and CSS and JavaScript files of a page from the Magento 2 Luma theme, and I just posted them on my page statically, and I didn't have any marketing pixels or anything like that, because sometimes those can come into play, specifically when you're measuring fully loaded time, which is what I'm measuring. But this was just executing fetching the styles and fetching the scripts and the HTML. I ran the test twice, and in this blue case, what we're seeing is when we are able to get the response back from that CDN location, which is somewhere in Australia. And then what we're seeing in red is when we've missed the CDN cache and we've gone all the way to the origin server from Australia to get it. And you can see that as a result of the CDN, we've brought the fully loaded time for this page down from basically 4.7 seconds to closer to 2.7 seconds. So we've cut a drastic amount of time off the amount of time that it takes to load that page, and we have a much more performant and user-friendly experience for the user. You might remember that when we had looked at the Webpage Test screenshot, that there were a few different things that it was grading you on for your score, your performance score. And as we had seen at that time, one of them was leveraging browser caching. Another one is actually using a CDN. So it's very interesting that Webpage Test, which is giving you a score of your performance, 2 out of 6 of the things that it's scoring you on are related to caching. Yet somehow there's this dialogue going on in the Magento community about caching not being related to performance, or caching not being a real performance strategy. And I'll just call out that at the bottom of my this slide, and I'm going to post these slides on my Twitter, which is at Max Chadwick. But there's a link there, which this was just one of the tests. I ran through a series of tests and tested some different configurations about the impact of a CDN, and there's more information about it at that link. And one final note in regards to CDN. So these providers, they give you edge caching, A lot of times they'll give you some extra stuff as well. So like you could get, you'll get like web application firewall features or DDoS protection. So you'll get some additional security features. Sometimes they'll even help you with some of the other performance stuff. So like Cloudflare, I know, for example, they'll actually rewrite your images on the fly, and they'll automatically compress and optimize them for you. So there's a lot of cool things that you get when you set up a CDN. All right, so again, we're following the request across the network. It started out in the browser. Maybe we got the browser caching. Now it's going across the network. Maybe we're getting some edge caching. But now we've reached the point where the request has ultimately reached the server. And there's a lot of caching that's happening on the server. But the type of caching that I want to cover here is full-page caching. So quickly, a definition of full-page caching. So what is it? When Magento handles a request, there's a lot of work that it needs to do to generate the HTML that it winds up sending back to the user. And so full-page caching, what it does is once that HTML has been generated, it just saves it. And then the next time somebody makes a request for that page, it doesn't need to do all that work again. It just sends back the exact same HTML. So the way that this works with Magento 2 is the way that you should be doing it with Magento 2 is you should be using Varnish as a reverse proxy. What this means is basically before the request gets to Magento, it first passes through Varnish, which is like a separate service that's running on the server. And Varnish saves that HTML in the cache on the server. This strategy of caching is supported in open source and Magento Commerce for Magento 2. For Magento 1, page caching is only in the enterprise edition of Magento 1. And the way that it's implemented is a little bit different. So it's not using Varnish. The request does still ultimately reach the server reach Magento. And Magento specifies a caching backend. So the most popular caching backend in Magento 1 is Redis. So the data will be saved there, but Magento does still start a PHP process, and Magento still does do a little bit of work. Not very much, but it still does do some. That being said, for Magento 1, there are plugins, commercial and community, that you can install that allow you to use both caching strategies in Magento 1. So if you want to use Varnish, you can use Turpentine, which comes from Nexus. It's free. It's on GitHub. And then there are a bunch of plugins that I've seen from various code bases that I've worked on that add full-page caching support to Magento 1 that use the other strategy where it's not using Varnish. It's in some backend, such as Redis, that it's saving in. So this is really the most drastic graph of all. And the gains that you get from full-page caching are really the most impressive thing, because Magento is kind of slow, and it kind of takes Magento a lot of time to give you a page. So this is what I'm measuring here is the time to first byte, and this is on Magento 1 actually, and I'm doing it on a category page. And one important thing to note here is that this is running on a local VM that I had, so there's no network overhead really with getting the request back. I just measured this using Chrome developer tools. It will tell you the time to first byte. And when we were able to hit the full page cache, it was, the time to first byte was basically negligible, because it really doesn't have to do anything. It just gives you back the HTML. It happened in 46 milliseconds. But when it missed the full page cache and it had to generate that entire HTML document, it was coming up on 2 seconds, 1.7 seconds to do that. So we're seeing a really big improvement in the what I would call the performance, the speed to generate the page back to the user as a result of this type of caching. So again, to go over some pro tips about page caching. So this is the thing that I always bring up, is to strip query parameters that the server doesn't need to increase the hit rate, such as GCLID. So if you don't know what GCLID is, if you have a site and you're running something like Google AdWords and you put a link to your site in AdWords, What Google will do is they'll actually, you say I want this URL. They'll take that URL, but they'll append this parameter to it that says GCLID equals, and then the important thing is that every single GCLID is unique. And what this means is that whenever somebody clicks that link, it's a new URL. So it's guaranteed to miss the cache because it's a unique URL that nobody's ever been to before. So that URL, it's the only reason that they're adding that there is because they have some JavaScript on the page that checks, oh, was it this parameter, and it sends it back for tracking purposes. So from a varnish standpoint, or a caching standpoint, it's literally the exact same page, and it doesn't need to cache those separately. So in Magento 2, GCLID is actually stripped by default. And if you take a look at the VCL that it generates, you can see it just uses a regex to match that, and there's a way in Varnish to strip it. But this isn't the only parameter that gets added to URLs that's like that. Very frequently, your email service provider, if you check a box that says like track clicks or track whatever, it will add a separate parameter like that. And this is really where we see a lot of downtime during like a high promotional volume is due to these parameters not being stripped from the URLs and them missing the cache every single time. So you need to take inventory and take stock and know what, just look at your logs and take a look at the different types of URLs and the different types of query parameters that are being added to those URLs, and understand if the server's using them or Varnish is using them. If the page varies on that parameter, you need to leave it. But if it's just some tracking thing that's being used by JavaScript, you should be stripping it out. And another thing about page caching is that it's really easy to mess this up. So I've definitely seen code bases where page cache literally does not work on any single page, and in Magento 2. And the reason is because an extension developer, or maybe a developer at an agency, didn't really have a good handle on how to deal with personalized content. So there's this way that you can solve the problem of personalized content. And if you go into your layout XML, if you're adding like a new block or something like that, you can say, oh, this block is not cacheable. Cacheable equals false. You put that in the layout for the block, you've solved your problem. What you've actually done is you didn't say don't cache this block. You said any page that has this block on it, I don't want you to you can't cache this page. And I've seen cases where that's in the default layout handle. So like I said, it literally means that every single request is not hitting the cache. So you should be monitoring your cache hit rates, because this can also just happen, just all of a sudden, like a client's like, hey, can you install this plugin? I want to work with this new, marketing thing. I'm like, okay, cool, yeah, we'll do it. And then, maybe you missed it until it went to production, because it's kind of a hard thing to catch locally, that actually now page cache is completely broken. So this was, when I said I've talked about caching before, actually I did an entire talk that was about monitoring your cache hit rate. It was specifically about doing it in Magento 1. There's a video available on Nomad Mage, and you can take a look at that and see how to do it in Magento 1. After I did that talk, Tony Brown, who's one of the people who works at Space 48, they're a UK agency, he saw it, and he basically ported over what I had done to Magento 2, and he's presented it before. I think it's on YouTube. So there's information about how to be monitoring your hit rates for both Magento 1 and Magento 2 that you can go out and find, and you should be finding. One other thing that I wanted to mention is, as I said, there's these parameters that get added to URLs that are completely unique. And at one point, it dawned on me that there's no centralized location where people can go and find out, oh, MailChimp adds this, or ListTrack adds this, or whatever. What are the different, I'm using this thing, what are the different parameters that I need to know about? So I decided that I would create an unofficial registry of those. And it's just a CSV file, and it just basically says what the provider is and what the parameter is. But it's up on my GitHub, and you can go there and you can see the different parameters that all these people are using. And I purposely put it on GitHub because I wanted, if you find one that's not on the list, I would really like you to submit me a pull request because I want, I don't know about them all, and you guys are going to run into stuff that I'm not going to run into. So I'd love if people contributed to this, and we started to use this as a place for keeping track of things. OK, so we've talked about browser caching, we've talked about edge caching, we've talked about page caching. What's the conclusion of all this? So as you can tell, I'm not really in the camp of caching is not equal to performance. I don't really agree with that. But I'm biased. So what I did was I ran a search, and the important thing here is that you can see that the bar, the Chrome address bar is black. So I'm in an incognito window now, and Google kind of tailors their search results based on what they know about you, and they probably know that I am a Magento developer and read about Magento. So I purposely went to an incognito window so that there would be no bias there. And I just searched for a very specific search for some these statements that are being said in the Magento community. So caching is not performance, or performance is not about caching. Either a match of either of those statements. And what's really interesting that I found is that if you look at all these top 6 results, and if you run this yourself and go through the results and go further in, every single one of these is something that's coming out of the Magento community. So this is not something that I've heard or seen being said anywhere than for some reason in the Magento community. So caching is not equal to performance. So what do I think about this? As you've gathered, I think that this is just incorrect. It's like factually incorrect. So when you define performance, or at least what I would think about performance, I would define it as making things run faster. And caching is a tried and true strategy for doing this at all levels of the stack. So like I said, we've just looked here at the browser, on the network, at the edge, and on the server. But this is happening, like I said in the beginning, this is happening in the Linux kernel with the page cache. This is happening at the CPU with branch prediction and things like that. Every single type of computing and programming that's happening is using caching to make things run faster. And so I think that this statement is actually harmful. Maybe people see this thing being published on the Magento forums or in different locations. Maybe they're kind of new to coding. Maybe they came out of a code school or something like this, and this is kind of their first experience or the first thing that they're hearing about caching. I think it's just seeding a bad idea in people's minds. So I'm going to correct the message here. So what's the correct message about caching? So caching is not the only part of performance, right? I think that's where this statement comes from, but I think it's kind of, it's too much of a blanket statement, and it does harm, in my opinion. So a better way to put it is that caching is not the only part of performance. So we know that we're not going to get caching every time. That's the nature of caching. There's going to be an uncached execution of the code. So we need to optimize for that as well, right? So if we look at something like edge caching, we know that the request edge and browser caching, we know that ultimately it's going to be talking to the server at some point. So we need to make sure that we didn't upload like a 5 megabyte ping file to the home page, which is taking forever to download. And we need to be using proper compression via gzip or Brotli, which is the new type of compression, which has better compression ratios when we're transferring things across the wire. There are a lot of optimizations that we need to be making when we're missing any of the types of caching that are involved. But saying that it's not a type of performance is just wrong. So to me, this is what the performance equation is it's a high cache hit rate, because we know that when we do hit the cache, it's just going to be faster no matter what. So we want to maximize for that. We want that to happen as much as possible. And then the other aspect of that is to optimize and as fast as possible. We know we're going to miss it. So when we do miss it, we want the code or whatever it is to execute as quickly as possible. And so that's the conclusion. That's what I had to say about this. And I'm happy to take any questions at this point. Yeah, so you were asking about cache warming?
on the microphone.
Yeah, is there any way to pre-warm the cache? Or is there a recommended way of doing that? Or?
Yeah, so the question is about cache warming. So my stance on cache warming is that really the only times that make sense to warm the cache are if you have if both of these things are true, it might not be a bad idea, but if you have low traffic and not a lot of products, warming the cache at that point, you don't have a lot of traffic that's naturally going to do it for you. And you don't have a lot of products, so it doesn't take that many server resources to get the cache warm. If you have a lot of traffic, one user is going to get it warm for you, and then a bunch of other users are going to benefit from that. And if you have a lot of products, then or pages just in general, categories, filtered, whatever, it's going to take a ton of resources for you to get that cache warmed. So if you have a lot of products and a lot of users, I wouldn't recommend using any kind of a cache warming strategy. I think you should rely on that one user who hit the page first to get it warm, and then everybody else will get the benefits. I think it's just a waste of computing resources.